Good day. You have joined us for another session on child maintenance in the Lunch and Learn webinar series. Today, I am talking to you about a slightly different angle, where we will basically be combining two of my passions, being child maintenance and children's rights, with the concept of environmental rights and environmental law. So let's get started. Here you can see the overview of the discussion that we will be following. You can just have a look there, but we will go through everything that is listed there. So firstly, let's start off with the concept of child maintenance as a right. Now, if you've been diligent in watching your Lunch and Learn over lunchtime or afterwards, then you know about the concept of child maintenance. Now, this concept is basically contained in various statutes, but also in the common law. So on the slides, you can see that it basically provides for, in the Maintenance Act, the support of children by monetary means or otherwise. Now, these modes of support do extend to items for living, such as home, food, clothing, education, and the necessities to sustain a basic lifestyle. It's basically just all of the bare necessities that you need to sustain a safe environment to live in. But maintenance is not limited to the bare necessities, as you would have known. And the focus of this webinar, however, will be on the lacking of these bare necessities and how it influences the environment that a child lives in. And then further, you can see on the slides that the Children's Act in sections 18 and sections 1 also provide for the duty of support, and it specifically provides that the duty of support or maintenance is a parental responsibility, and that it is the children's parents who are responsible for fulfilling the child's right to maintenance and all of the other constitutional rights. So just as I said, this is a well-known concept that parents are responsible for children to be able to fulfill their rights. Now, this is contained specifically in the Constitution in Section 28, where it provides that children have the right to these various things, and these things link up directly with maintenance, such as nutrition, shelter, basic healthcare services, and social services. And in the Grootboom case, it was also provided that it remains squarely on the parents to allow children to exercise their constitutional rights, especially the rights contained in Section 28. So therefore, maintenance is a parental responsibility to ensure that a child has an adequate environment to grow up in. Now, this concept of environment directly links to the things that maintenance is supposed to cover. And the concept of environment is fleshed out a lot more in environmental law, but also in the various statutes that govern environmental law. So the definition of environment, as you can see in the NEMA Act, basically includes all of these things. But the part that I highlighted there is the part that I would like to focus on today. And that is basically encapsulates that the environment includes various aspects of the ecosystem, such as land, water, atmosphere, and also microorganisms, plant and animal life, and also a combination of those things. But it also, very importantly, includes the physical, chemical, aesthetic, and cultural properties and conditions of these items that I just now listed that influence human health and well-being. Those are kind of key terms, the human health and well-being part of the definition of environment, specifically in environmental law or in the NEMA Act, which governs environmental law in South Africa. And it approaches the idea of an environment in a much more holistic way, where it basically extends to human health and well-being as affected by various aspects of Earth. Now, how does child maintenance link up to this idea of an environment? And basically, as I just said, where the definition of an environment extends to human health and well-being, you can clearly see that the idea of an environment, the legal concept of environment, is not confined to the mere physical environment, but it does encapsulate other things that influence the humans that are living in an ecosystem or in an environment. And therefore that any impact that is negative from an environmental standpoint is directly linked to an environmental issue, but also it can be considered an environmental issue. So these concepts will be fleshed out as we go forward. But for example, the being able to live in conditions that aren't conducive to your health and well-being would be considered an environmental issue, specifically if those conditions are caused by the fact that you are not being maintained as a child or you are being inadequately maintained. Now, some of these environmental rights that I've been alluding to are contained obviously in the Constitution, but in a lot of other legislative pieces as well. Now, the Constitution in Section 24 specifically states and re-emphasizes the idea that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being. And it further goes on to say that everyone has the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations. And then the other part that I specifically want to emphasize is that it has to protect the environment and also prevent pollution, ecological degradation, promote conservation and sustainable development, which we will be discussing in other webinars, while promoting justifiable economic and social development. Now, that's an interesting term to use, and it will definitely be discussed as we go forward. So, as you can see from that provision, we have two types of environmental rights contained in the Constitution. Firstly, it's the right of humans to a safe and healthy environment. And secondly, it's the right of the environment, even though the environment is not considered to have human rights in itself, not to be degraded. But here, obviously, our focus will largely be on these rights pertaining to a custodial parent who has the primary care of a child and who's asking for maintenance, which is in South Africa, mostly the mother, and also the child themselves to have a safe environment, or an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being. Now, generally, these are green rights or solidarity rights, which is aimed at the public at large. And it does impose positive obligations on the state. But here we won't be talking about how we can approach the government to assist. Here we're going to rather focus on private action, such as maintenance. And then also, just to affirm that notion, is that these rights contained in the Constitution apply vertically to the state, but also horizontally between natural and juristic persons, which means that a private person, a natural person, can also be held liable for failure to fulfill these rights of certain people or against certain people. So just to flesh out Section 24, here again we can talk about, or we can see, the concept of health and well-being is largely emphasized in these constitutional environmental rights. Now, I have also thought about it, and how does this overlap with other rights, such as, for example, in Section 27, the right to access of healthcare, And that will be detailed later on, because those rights and those pieces of legislation, other pieces of legislation, are also very, very relevant, apart from just other sections in the Constitution. But here we focus on the right to health and well-being. So firstly, we have the right to an environment that is not harmful to health. Now, this is an idea that is recognized in the common law, and it can be understood as an environment which is harmful to your health would be an environment where you are exposed to air pollution or polluted water as your main source of drinking water. And the idea of health is quite a broad idea, but not as broad as the idea of well-being. Even though the World Health Organization also defines health as this quite broad idea of a wider state of complete mental, physical, and social well-being. But all of these ideas are contained in the notion of well-being. So our right to an environment that is not harmful to well-being is quite broad. It relates to many aspects, such as a sense of place or the quality of life. And it's not necessarily linked to direct health impacts, but just the overall state of living. And in the case that I mentioned on the slide there, a stench, exposure to a stench, was actually regarded as being adverse to one's health and well-being. And obviously, things like that, things where you have a diminished sense of well-being, will influence your other rights. So just to kind of sketch a picture of just basic things that we need as human beings, but specifically children, to have a satisfactory level of health and well-being. As listed on the slide there, you can see I highlighted adequate nutritional food and water, adequate protective housing, but mainly, and also a non-hazardous physical environment and economic security, but most importantly is security in childhood, and probably I would say economic security as well. And that directly ties into the idea of maintenance, and how maintenance is kind of crucial to sustain the health and well-being of children. So here are just a few factors that I could think of that basically show the impact that inadequate child maintenance or complete lack of child maintenance have on the health and well-being of children living in these households. So firstly, we can see in regards to housing and living conditions, substandard housing, overcrowding, and unstable living environment or arrangements will basically definitely cause exposure to an unhealthy or unsafe living conditions that include mold, lead, pests, or unsafe neighborhoods. And that will be fleshed out in a later slide as well. And then nutrition and food security, which will definitely have an impact on things such as malnutrition and indirectly leading to developmental problems. Obviously, access to healthcare in areas where you have an unstable living arrangement or insufficient funds to be able to have basic access to healthcare services. It can also drastically affect things such as preventative care, vaccinations, and the necessary medical treatments. And then also education, where there is an inadequate amount of maintenance or a lack of maintenance. There won't be enough resources for books, school supplies, and other things that basically contribute to academic success and a future for these children. And it also links into education about the environment and sustainability, which we'll discuss in a minute. And then other factors that we can take into account is social support, the stress and anxiety that a child experiences when they have to live in a house that is not meeting their basic needs, and just the overall financial instability and poverty, how it affects mental health and their development. Safety and security is also a very important one, because it will ultimately, or it can ultimately lead to these children having to be forced to live in neighborhoods that are unsafe, that have high crime rates, and a lack of proper safety measures, which also in turn has an impact on the environment, as we will discuss later. And then access to technology, that is also another obvious one, where insufficient funds directly link up to not being able to have proper access to technology and being able to flourish in the digital age that we are living in. And then other things are obviously exposure to environmental hazards, where a child is basically living in an area where they don't have the sufficient protection to guard against environmental hazards. And again, things such as pollution, lead exposure, or even if you have to live close to an industrial site or in an industrial site, will definitely have an increased risk of environmental hazards. Limited recreational opportunities also ties in with the locality of where children live, or are forced to live, with the means that they are provided, the maintenance that they are provided, and then inequality and discrimination. Now that's a broader impact, which will be fleshed out as we go forward. There are specific health consequences, however, and these things can be due to various environmental factors, such as floods, heat waves, landslides, water shortage, or even UV radiation. And these things can lead to even more infectious diseases, or an increased risk of infectious diseases, a reduced food yield, as we previously said as well, nutrition, and then therefore a depletion of natural resources. But it also has direct impacts, such as the livelihood loss, or the loss of livelihood, and population displacement, as we'll also discuss in the forming of slums in a later slide. Now, to continue on our constitutional environmental right journey, Section B specifically provides for the idea of intergenerational equity. In the phrase that I highlighted there, where it refers to everybody has the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations. And then also the second part that I'm going to talk about is you have to be able to have the right to have the environment protected by these various means, or in these various aspects, while promoting a justifiable economic and social development mark. So as you can see, the concept of intergenerational equity basically relates to the idea that parents basically carry the burden to secure their children's futures, but not even just their children, but the generations to come. And the idea of sustainable development is also mentioned in this section, which we can talk about for hours, and we will definitely have up and coming webinars on the notion of sustainable development. So talking about intergenerational equity, it's quite evident how a lack of child maintenance, neglect, and poverty hinders this idea and this goal that we have in an environmental context, because it perpetuates the disadvantaged households and communities, basically causing a vicious cycle where there is a lack of a better opportunity for the future, and also it hinders children to reach their full potential, which makes it impossible to break the cycle of poverty. And it hinders the custodial parent to be able to invest in their child's future, to be able to better the living arrangement that they find themselves in due to this inadequacy of maintenance or complete lack of maintenance. And then the second part that I wanted to talk about is the lack of social and economic development, which is the key phrase also used in the constitutional section dealing with environmental rights. And it's also listed on the slide about how this economic instability will directly hinder a family's economic security, which causes a complete disregard for the likelihood of better opportunities, getting out of the cycle of poverty. This can have severe consequences on the cognitive development of these children, especially where it is due to poor access to healthcare services, but also a larger impact where it has this psychosocial sphere attached to the impact, which definitely will not contribute to the development of society in a social or economic way. Other things, again, following the path of poverty will also mean that these children and their parents, the custodial parent, will struggle to achieve upwards mobility. Actually more specifically the children in their adult lives, they won't be able to break the cycle and have financial stability. Ultimately, another factor that I found quite interesting was that where maintenance is inadequate and children don't have these opportunities, this will also impact the society as a whole, in the sense that there is a loss of workforce or a loss of human capital in the workforce, but also a large part of the workforce that could be aimed at bettering the circumstances of our environment and just sustainability in general. But ultimately, it makes sense that child maintenance and the severe impacts it can have on health and well-being, but also the more psychological aspect of well-being, how it can contribute to undermining social cohesion and contribute to the opposite, which is social unrest. And yeah, these things are very interrelated. That was now just the constitutional part of environmental rights, thinking about child maintenance. But there are so many other pieces of legislation which are relevant in this context. And you can't talk about children's rights without encapsulating all of the other constitutional rights and pieces of legislation that directly regulate the lifestyle that a child is supposed to have, and also the rights that a child has to basically secure a basic lifestyle and the basic necessities that they need to survive, not to thrive necessarily, but to just survive. So we will be talking about a few other pieces of legislation that is relevant. But firstly, before we get into the Maintenance Act and the Children's Act, let's think about the nuance that we find in the maintenance issues, such as completely failing to pay maintenance or paying inadequate maintenance, a laughable amount of maintenance, and the idea of neglect. And it's not hard to draw a line connecting those two concepts, because where maintenance is obviously dependent on the means of the parent. If you would have watched our Lunch and Learn videos, you would have known that it can overlap with the idea of neglect, where neglect can be defined as the failure to provide adequate care, not even just care, but adequate care or support, where a parent is legally obliged to do so. Now, the idea of being legally obliged is very relevant, but also not as relevant, because the duty to maintain a child actually is a common law concept, which means it exists regardless. It's a duty and a right, or a duty of parents and a right of children, no matter the operation of the law, as it is contained in the common law. And if we just flesh out the idea of neglect and how closely that relates to the consequences of a complete lack of maintenance being paid to a custodial parent to support a child, or even just paying an inadequate amount of maintenance where it really is not enough to live a proper life. Once again, it being basically a laughable amount, and how that can overlap with neglect, where you fail to provide necessities such as food, shelter, medical care, education, or protection from harm. It made me think a lot, and it basically led me to wanting to ask the question of, when can we draw a line? And is the failure or inadequacy of paying maintenance, or the failure of paying maintenance or inadequate maintenance, is it a form of neglect where a child's environment is harmful as a direct result of maintenance not being enough or maintenance not being paid? And I found these provisions in the Children's Act very interesting to the conversation. And because there are these offences contained in section 305, which emphasizes how we take it very serious when a parent is guilty of neglecting a child. So in section 305, subsection 3, we see that a parent who deliberately neglects or abandons a child is guilty of an offence. Further, it's also an offence if a parent who is legally liable and able to maintain a child is guilty of failing to provide the child with adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical assistance. And the word adequate is used there, which means that it's not just the failure to provide for it, but the failure of providing adequate resources, such as those things. And then obviously we can't talk about the Children's Act without mentioning section 7, the best interest of the child, which is also contained in section 28, subsection 2 of the Constitution, where these things definitely contribute to what would be the best interest of the child. And then section 10, which takes note of child participation, especially when they try to voice concerns about their environment and their lifestyle and what they need from their environment. And then the Maintenance Act also, interestingly enough, provides for the seriousness of not maintaining a child, and how it is an offence to not pay maintenance in accordance with a court order, and also that a lack of means cannot be a defence to not paying maintenance. You can't escape this offence if you pay maintenance, or if you fail to pay maintenance, because you don't have the means, because maintenance is dependent on the means. If you are unwilling to work, or if it's due to misconduct, of course, but that's a little bit more nuanced. But the unwillingness to work really got me thinking about the different ways we can tackle this issue. But ultimately, these two sections, these two offences contained in the Maintenance Act, definitely is emphasized, and it just goes to show how serious we take it when parents don't pay maintenance, and how it can almost amount to a form of neglect, and how it almost directly overlaps with other human rights. So other relevant rights that I could think of in this context would, obviously, like we already discussed, section 24 of the Constitution, where we have the right to an environment not harmful to the health and well-being, or health or well-being, which is what we fleshed out in the earlier slides. And then also other rights, such as the right to sufficient food and water, Section 28, Section 27 of the Constitution, the right to basic education, which we also touched on. Other rights such as the right to healthcare services, and again, the right to protection from environmental harm, which is again a bit more general compared to health and well-being, but is definitely also a consideration and a right that is definitely touched on in a context, a sad context like this. The right to social security will also be a constitutional right, which is definitely arguably violated, or at least infringed upon, when a parent fails to pay maintenance or pays inadequate maintenance. And then ultimately, if you think about the more holistic approach to the effect that the non-payment of child maintenance and or inadequate maintenance and leading you to live in deplorable conditions, the effect that it has on society as a whole, which can arguably also amount to a violation of the right to equality and non-discrimination in the Constitution, which, oh, I see my slide is cut off, but yeah, that's also a right that I feel like is definitely affected in this context. So now we've already spoken about the multifaceted impact that the maintenance system has on the environment, not on just the environment itself, which we will get to now, but on the environment of a child, where they have the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being. But also the idea of neglect in the concept that is mentioned in the Constitution, where we talk about intergenerational equity and also the development in a social and economic level. But now we will be talking about the environment itself and how living in such conditions actually does have both a direct and an indirect impact on the environment, especially when you think about the processes related to applying for maintenance and everything going with it. So just a few things listed to think about that has an impact on the environment. So when you are living in a household with inadequate maintenance, things such as resource consumption will be an issue. Basically having to cut back on certain appliances that might actually be making your life more green. Also food and water waste, actually specifically, or in a large part, water waste as well, where food insecurity will basically have a large part to play in this role, and also then indirectly leading to malnutrition, as we previously spoke about, but also just generally contributing to waste by having unsustainable food and packaging, ultimately leading to environmental degradation. And then also the healthcare and environmental costs related to it, where these households are impacted by the lacking access to adequate healthcare, and their susceptibility to illnesses and the higher risk of contracting infectious diseases will ultimately place a burden on the healthcare system and increase costs to ensure that those systems are actually functioning properly. And then other things that, or other considerations to take into account when thinking about households that have inadequate maintenance and how that affects the environment, will also be their access to green spaces, where living in, for example, an industrial site or a place that is far removed and highly polluted will definitely disconnect you from your sense of being a human being on Earth. And that may lead to careless pollution and a complete disregard for the ecosystem. And then also things such as urban planning and mobility is a consideration, which might not be an issue for families that are living in poverty, but maybe more the middle class families that have to then overtly rely on personal vehicles, and basically also contributing to traffic and air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And then again, the overarching social idea of inequality, and how environmental justice is not being reached when these social and economic inequalities are being perpetuated, and especially also where these marginalized communities have to really bear the burden of the environmental issues that their communities face. And then another interesting thought process that led me to this slide was the impact that courts have on the environment. And this can be a whole webinar in itself, but just a few things specifically pertaining to maintenance, which really made me think, was the fact that the current maintenance system is largely paper-based. And this is definitely not the greenest way to go about things, especially where most of the correspondence and applications and all of the files and documents and records basically take up space. And also later on, I mention the energy consumption of these systems being paper-based, and just the disposal of the paper, which also contributes to waste, and landfills, and obviously the use of paper to such a large extent will also contribute to deforestation and all gas emissions. But then talking about emissions, also the fact that the maintenance system is not geared for efficiency. A lot of people that have been through the system know that you are struggling to meet your financial needs, because you are struggling to apply for maintenance because the system is not tailor-made for the context that the people find themselves in. Meaning you have to go to court to apply, and then it doesn't work out, or your proceedings are delayed, and then you have to go back to court. And most of these people don't live near courts, which ultimately means that the travel, that is basically the traveling burden that is placed on mostly mothers in South Africa, or just the custodial parent, is definitely not a good factor for the environment. And it can definitely lead to other larger issues with the carbon emissions, and just the overall insufficiency of the maintenance proceeding. And those are things that we've touched on many times in the Lunch and Learn series on maintenance. And then this is where I believe the courts could definitely try and move away from these paper-based proceedings to a more digital solution, especially when it comes to maintenance, because there's no need to make things harder than they need to be. This is obviously not a reality for South Africa at the moment, or for everybody in South Africa, but it could be a solution to the negative print that courts leave, especially the maintenance court leave, on the environment, where we can substitute all of these paper-based proceedings for electronic filing systems, video conferencing, and just online communication in general, just to increase, number one, the efficacy of the maintenance court, but also reducing the need for paper, and the negative environmental impacts and consequences that comes with the use of paper. But ultimately, the issue of poverty is something that I want to touch on, because we are going to have to be very creative in how we reach the poor communities when trying to make the maintenance system as easy as possible. So here are just a few factors that intrigued me when I thought about the impact of poverty on the environment. And things such as overexploitation of natural resources will obviously be leading to deforestation, where firewood is used, and also unsustainable farming practice will also result in depletion of natural resources. This also leads to a form of unsustainable agriculture, which can also cause soil degradation. But poor people also lack access to even be able to have clean energy, let alone education about clean energy. And these will also this will also lead to using or falling back on traditional fuels and traditional modes of energy, such as biomass fuels, which also has severely negative environmental influences and consequences, such as air pollution and negative health effects. Further impacts that poor communities and just poverty in general has on the environment would be improper waste management, which obviously will, to a large extent, damage the environment, but also be harmful to the health and well-being of people living close to these environments or even living in these environments, and can also cause things such as open dumping, littering, and the release of untreated wastewater into rivers and oceans, which is a big no-go. And then, like I said previously, another impact that poverty has on the environment, which is quite negative, largely, would be the development of slums, which might not be a negative in itself, but where it contributes to pollution, overcrowding, and living in unsanitary conditions, it could harm the local environment, but also public health, which is definitely something worth addressing, even though it might not be an immediate fix, but it could be a consideration in how the environment is actually being impacted in this. And then also poaching and illegal resource extraction as a means of survival could also have a severely negative impact on the environment. And yeah, which is a large thing that we do find in poor communities and people who are just desperate to survive. And then further, vulnerability to environmental risks basically talks more about the people living in these poor communities who mostly will experience impacts of natural disasters and climate change. Also, the lack of environmental education is things that we've spoken about in previous slides. And then another impact on the environment will be the loss of diversity, where, for example, just the urbanization and slum development could also cause habitat destruction, and also a disregard for the environment, like we said previously, that can encroach on natural habitats, especially where people have to do that to meet their immediate needs and where they are desperate. Now, talking about poverty has to be a very nuanced discussion when we talk about maintenance, because as we know, maintenance is dependent on the means of the parents. But when a parent is poor, they don't have means to maintain their child. And this is where I feel largely that I want to encourage private action, to look to ourselves, to look to our community, to help each other, and to encourage better days to come, instead of waiting for them, and really working towards fixing, or at least just trying to put systems in place that we can use to implement mobilization in these vicious cycles pertaining to maintenance and poverty. and the environmental issues that come with it. So on this slide here, I said that social creativity is needed to overcome these generational struggles. And a few things that I really do feel are important to end this cycle would be activism independent of traditional power structures. And that's also what I meant with encouraging better days to come instead of waiting for them to happen, where we shift our trust away from having the government or other state support structures come in to help us, but where we, while we can, try and do what we can for ourselves and our community, instead of relying on these traditional power structures, which often tend to fail in their duties to support the civilians that are really struggling. And then other things that which also link up to really working towards fixing the situation would be green entrepreneurship and a willingness to make work for income. And that also relates to the Offence in the Maintenance Act in Section 31, where it's not a defense to the obligation to pay maintenance, where you don't have the means, but you are unwilling to work. And that is where I really do feel that parents who give it their all and have a willingness and are keen to try and make work for themselves and being an entrepreneur can really encourage mobilization in these aspects of life. And then also other things such as organic and volunteer-based community organizing and development initiatives, which we have seen a lot more in the modern structure of maintenance, but also in the environmental aspect of things, which is really awesome to see a community come together and make a plan for themselves instead of relying on anybody else. You rely on your community and your own skills and what you can contribute to the community. And this also extends to building community-based support networks, where, the support is coming from the community instead of just being hopeless. You find hope in the community. And then ultimately, I would love to touch on these few approaches, which I would like to call a grassroots approach, more a bottom-up approach of how we can affect the environmental and social justice issues, the larger issues that come from the issues that we find in child maintenance. Once again, community education and awareness is something that we need, and that is what we are aiming for with our free webinars, really empowering people to take things into their own hands and not being hopeless, but being empowered. And then also things such as interim maintenance orders for urgent and dire situations could also be useful. Now we have various webinars on interim maintenance and how you can apply for it. And I would urge you to go watch them, to maybe make use of that as a solution to a problem that you might be facing. Legal aid clinics and partnerships with environmental organizations is a great way to also mobilize these issues that we face in society. And then also, if things turn really dire, we can also resort to class actions where we can even use Section 24 of the Constitution as a trigger for standing, where a large group of people can actually approach the state and really try to adjudicate or litigate on the matter to ensure that their rights are indeed being met according to the state's obligations. And then again, community engagement and lobbying to better the maintenance system by policy recommendations, which we would always encourage. Advocacy for children's rights, which is definitely something we also find close to home and that we really want to incorporate in our webinars, especially our webinars on the Children's Act and children's rights in general. And then the promotion of sustainable development and the just transition to clean energy, which is also a concept found in our general laws that reach internationally as well, which we will also be discussing in later webinars, specifically pertaining to the just transition framework and just social development as a general idea. And then ultimately, I think we've spoken about so many different things and contexts, different types of communities, but I do think it's very important to take principles on of being inclusive and non-discriminatory when we talk about environmental issues, because the environment is not enclosed to only certain classes of people or only certain people. It really does extend to, it has no boundaries. So we need to be inclusive and really embrace everything that we find ourselves in. And also embrace the concept of Ubuntu, to find hope beyond the hopelessness that the environmental issues that some communities face, but also those environmental issues that may specifically be linked to child maintenance and the living conditions that may arise when child maintenance is not being paid or is inadequate and a laughable amount. But ultimately, that was my talk for the day, and I really do appreciate every single viewer who spent the time to just learn something about environmental law, but also fleshing out your knowledge on child maintenance and really empowering yourself and equipping yourself with the knowledge to be able to break free from the vicious cycles that we do find ourselves in. And we will be definitely pushing more environmental related and educational webinars in future. And yeah, I just want to say thank you again for your support. And yeah, we will be in touch soon.